I'd like to introduce our keynote, Dr. Keith Hjelmstad, who is a President's Professor of Structural Engineering in the School of Sustainable Engineering in the Built Environment. From 2008 to 2011, he was the University Vice President and Dean of the College of Technology and Innovation at ASU at the Polytechnic campus. And prior to coming to ASU, he was with the University of Illinois for 25 years. He's the author of 2 books, one of which, The Fundamentals of Structural Dynamics Theory and Computation, was recently published in 2022, so congratulations. And today we've invited him to speak as our keynote to share about his experience with reflective and iterative teaching. So, welcome, Keith.
Okay. Well, I am pleased and honored to be here. I'm honored that you even asked me. When Kristen first approached me, she threw out the idea of focusing on reflective and iterative teaching, and I did not know what that was. But once I convinced myself that these were not special reserved words owned by education people, I decided that I might have something to say. After all, I have been reflecting and iterating on my teaching now for over 40 years. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask anyone to get off my lawn. But I am going to tell you what I know about reflective and iterative teaching. Oops, wrong way. There are at least 2 perspectives that are important to reflection in teaching and learning. The instructor to self perspective, which I summarize with the question, how do I incorporate reflection and refinement in my teaching process? And the instructor to student perspective, how do I get my students to reflect on their own learning process? These are not the same thing, but I'm going to talk about both. First, let's consider the instructor to self perspective. One might think of the process of reflecting and iterative teaching as a cycle through planning, execution, getting feedback, reflecting, and refining to plan the next cycle. I think all instructors do this, but with different levels of emphasis. The amount of planning that goes into each semester varies a lot, from dusting off old notes to major redesign. For many instructors, designing the Canvas website dominates the planning stage. Most instructors probably think of execution as the main event. That is what you do for 15 weeks every semester. I used to be a build the plane while flying it type of planning executioner. I would never get to the last topic in the syllabus. I have mended my ways. For most faculty, the getting feedback bit is limited to the dreaded institutional course evaluations, but there are lots of ways to get feedback. Some are better than others. Reflection and refinement is what I want to focus on today. This is the process of thinking about what you did and how it went and fixing things. Bring your beginner's mind to this task. Don't ignore what you've learned from experience, but don't be limited by it either. Seek feedback, reflect on it, take a balanced approach. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Work on multiple time scales. See the long arc, but be willing to make daily adjustments. Through this process, embrace failure. Take it as a learning opportunity, not as a measure of your ability or value. And when you have a good idea, persevere. You might be seeing something that others have not yet seen. Let me set some context. The first 30 years of my teaching were cut from a pretty traditional mode. I lectured, I assigned homework, I gave midterms and finals, I graded papers, and I gave final grades. When I started teaching, I knew almost nothing about it. I had observed teaching for years, but when my turn came, I quickly realized how little I knew about it. I prepared to teach as I imagined my instructors must have, and I taught as I had been taught. Later on, I had some administrative experiences that got me thinking more broadly about teaching. How many of us know only our own classroom? Getting outside of my own bubble helped me a lot. When I came to ASU, I got to hang around with some people who were really knowledgeable about teaching and learning. But I had administrative responsibilities at the time, and that left me with little time to teach. Then I got my big break. I was invited to go back to the faculty. Over the last dozen years here at ASU, I've been engaged in an experiment I call the Mechanics Project, which in a nutshell is an effort to improve instruction in the sophomore level mechanics courses, statics, dynamics, and deformable solids. I took on dynamics first and basically turned everything on its head in one semester. Doing that heavy lift had some clear downsides, but it did allow me to take a more integrative approach. It was not incremental progress. It was an all-out closet cleaning. We got all 3 courses started in the fall of 2012, but the main hoist of statics was a year after dynamics, and deformable solids was fully revised a year after that. We've been running now for 23 semesters. The flat lines in the illustration are deceptive because we reflect and refine every semester and have made numerous changes as a result. There are 4 main categories where changes occurred. The first was how we dealt with class time. Basically, we flipped the classroom and we incorporated UGTAs on the instructional team. Second, we created course materials to support the pedagogical changes. Third, we implemented a mastery-based grading scheme. And finally, we introduced computing projects as a key part of the course. In the design of the mechanics project, we questioned everything. Is lecture the best approach to delivery? When we give an exam, what are we really finding out? Are the topics in the course still relevant? Has anything in the world changed that might suggest changing how we approach the course? The slide lists some areas of innovation. Multi-course integration is a rarity in our a la carte instructional world, but there can be some serious learning losses without it. The flipped classroom concept was still pretty new at the time. I didn't even know it was called that. I just knew I wanted the students to be actively engaged in solving problems. Team teaching is a break from our usual 1 course equals 1 instructor universe. Our approach is not the usual baton handoff at mid-semester either. In the area of mastery-based grading, I was looking for anything to break out of the traditional grading mold. Somehow, the computer revolution had missed these classes. Introducing computing projects was aimed at fixing that. I wanted to get students to see the other side of doing assignments, so I included peer review of the computing projects. Self-assessment of exams is a way to get students to embrace failure in a healthy way. And I wanted assessments to be formative and for students to think differently about what they can learn from them. Students live and die by grades. In fact, they are addicted to grades. I wanted to design a feedback mechanism that would motivate different student learning behaviors. We all create course materials, but we really innovated in course content too. Over the years, we've added, subtracted, modified, and adjusted many aspects of this learning environment. Each time we changed something, it was an attempt to solve a particular problem, bridging a gap, redirecting motivation, making something clearer, simplifying something. That process continues to this day, but the pedagogy of the course is pretty steady at this point. I want to start out by reflecting on reflection. You see what I did there? And let's focus on the instructor to self perspective first. These are the things you think about and do to improve your own performance as a teacher. These are things you do to set the learning environment and make it run smoothly. These are things that, if done well, the students won't notice. Let's first take a look at getting feedback and using that feedback for reflection and refinement. The traditional feedback that instructors get about their teaching comes from the institutional course evaluations. Since these evaluations are used in the promotion and tenure process, they have a huge influence on how we reflect on our teaching. And since only the numerical scores are used in the promotion process, the comments collected, which quite frankly are often conflicting, take a back seat to the numerical data. The traditional reflection cycle that I engaged in for many years included three main parts. One, dreading course evaluations. Two, getting course evaluations. Three, blaming my low course evaluations on the students. I know a lot of people who do the same thing. It isn't very reflective. I was tortured by the feedback, and I could feel it draining my creativity. I was afraid to change anything for fear that the students wouldn't react well to it. What you can see in this graph is that the first semester of innovation in the mechanics project met with horrible course evaluations and some pretty nasty comments too. No good deed goes unpunished. It's very common to take a hit in course evaluations when you try something new. This is a great deterrent for young instructors, by the way. The farther you drift from what students are used to, the bigger the hit. You can also see that things got a lot better the very next semester. We made a large number of changes based upon what we learned in the first semester, and thankfully, the students responded well to those changes. I doubt the project would have survived another drubbing. The other take-home from this graph is that we've seen steady improvement over time, at least from the perspective of how students experience our learning environment. These improvements were the result of reflection and refinement. The institutional course evaluation is a very blunt instrument. Students answer the same questions for all courses. And if you have not read those questions recently, I suggest that you do. They are not great questions. It is really hard to squeeze any actionable information from the institutional course evaluations. So, we created our own course survey and we administer it near the end of every semester. In our survey, we ask specifically about pedagogical features that we use in our course. This practice allows us to find out very directly what works well and what does not. We also get some good suggestions along the way. This is what one data point from the FSE course evaluations looks like up close. We get a very good picture of how students respond to the various course features. This chart shows the response to the question of how helpful each feature was to their learning. We also ask them how much they enjoy the features. They do know the difference. We ask them to identify their 3 top features and their 3 bottom features. For these 6 items, we ask them why they selected them. This is where the detailed comments come from. As you can see, every feature gets some action. Well, office hours didn't get much, but everything else did. The comments are, as you might expect, all over the map. The students take this feedback opportunity very seriously. The comments are quite thoughtful. Most importantly, they are about the learning environment as we executed it and as they experienced it. We get comments on every aspect of the course. It is a huge amount of information. This semester, we got 35 pages of comments totaling over 18,000 words. We hear from every student in the class. For example, here's a comment from a student this semester about why they put recitation in their top 3 course features. Quote, recitation is definitely more helpful than just a regular lecture. For me, it is hard to do the practice problems on my own, and that is probably the easiest way for me to actually grasp the concepts. Doing problems in class while there is immediate guidance and assistance encouraged my learning. It was also nice that I didn't feel rushed to finish the problems during class, and I could access the solutions at home. It allowed me to focus on the process rather than just finishing so I could get points. This student seems to exactly get the pedagogical design of recitation. Of course, not all comments are positive. Here's one from a student who listed recitation in their bottom 3 features. Quote, "I found the recitations to be too big, too loud, and too busy. Having such a big crowd in a single room made it feel super cramped and made it hard to focus. I think breaking the recitations into smaller overall groups would help combat this. I also think letting people float between groups to find a group they fit best in for the first week or 2 would also be helpful." Notice that this one gives a tangible suggestion for improvement. Of course, we have already thought about the grouping issue many times before, so it's not something we're likely to implement. However, one big change this semester was that we had a section size of 65 students in a single room with pretty bad acoustics for the first time. Comments like this help us to understand the physical limits of the flipped classroom. Let's talk about iterative teaching. We all do iterative teaching because we get assigned to teach every semester. What happens most often is the cycle on top. The first time through, there's some reflection, but then you slump into steady state. Many teachers start thinking about teaching a week or so before the semester begins. Some don't even know their assignment until then. That almost eliminates the chance for refinement. It also gives a huge incentive to dust off old notes and teach the exact same course as last time. What we would like to see is repeated reflection and refinement. That is iterative teaching. You don't have to look at these cycles as semesters. They could be individual assignments. We give 6 computing projects in our course, for example. Each iteration could be one of those. You might learn something from the first one that you could easily change for the next one. No need to wait a whole semester. It could be every class period, but that sounds pretty exhausting. By far the most intensive reflection I did in forming the mechanics project was in the year before we launched that first semester. I had about 30 years of pent-up reflecting to do. I did a lot of writing to help me come to terms with different issues in the planning. Writing always helps with reflection because you can't hide from the words on the page. It helps you to make more reasoned arguments. After each of the first few semesters, I wrote a progress report to aid reflection on what the semester brought. Obviously, we had a lot of reflecting to do after that first semester. I eventually wrote a book that captures the philosophy and details of our learning environment. When Kristen first asked me to talk about iteration, I got really excited. My favorite iterative algorithm is Newton's method for solving nonlinear algebraic equations. Newton's method has 3 things in common with iterative teaching. First, you have to start somewhere. Second, you need some strategy to improve. And third, you need feedback to tell you if you're converging. There are some other features of Newton's method that ring true for iterative teaching too. The iteration does not always converge. Sometimes things get worse before they get better. And finally, you can usually tell when things are going off the rails. We've made numerous changes over the last decade. Let's go through some specific examples. When we started up the flipped classroom, we had no idea how to do it. We learned pretty quickly. We discovered that students really like the social atmosphere, but they need to be challenged to stay engaged. Giving tasks that are too simple leads to disengagement. Here are a few things that we changed along the way to improve our flipped classroom. We started with 50-minute recitations. That was too short. They were also awkwardly scheduled. With the second semester, we moved to 75-minute recitations. Students need enough time to unpack their bags and settle in. We started with a modular design, but it was based on topics. We eventually moved to a fixed 2-week schedule of modules. The logistics of running the course just worked better that way. Some topics span multiple modules. We reduced lecture to once per module at the start. Those lectures were delivered face-to-face, 2 instructors on stage passing the baton back and forth. Then the pandemic hit. I recorded the lectures and we repurposed the lecture day to focus on computing projects. The assessment and grading strategies were designed to break away from student addiction to scoring. It required a fair amount of adjustment over time. The mastery objectives are the heart of mastery-based grading. There's a Goldilocks zone with the number and detail of objectives. We revised the objectives multiple times before we found that zone. It took a few tries to refine the logistics of the mastery assessments. We now have 7, 1 for each 2-week module. If you do something new, you're going to have to sell it to the students. We have increased information flow on many aspects of the course, but we had to work especially hard on selling the grading strategy. The students really get it now, and they like it. What do students do when they finish a homework assignment? They move on with their lives. No what ifs, no I wonder whys. Heck, you are lucky if you can even get them to go back and troubleshoot their errors. CPs were introduced to promote exploration. Some things we changed along the way included the workload. The CP workload has always been high. We went from 7 to 6 per semester early on and had debated further changes endlessly. 6 is a nice number, though, so we've had to work on making each one a little bit more accessible. Our students did not know how to code. We started with just a few notes on MATLAB. Students struggled a lot. We introduced little in-class MATLAB moments. That helped a little. The pandemic then gave us CP days, which is a direct code along where the instructor talks them through the coding exercise. Now, students can focus on the mechanics, not just on finding bugs. Getting students to engage in inquiry is a lot harder than it looks. I wrote guidance documents, a sample report, and a detailed grading rubric to convey expectations better. We're still working on ways to get students to go deeper in their inquiry and to write better reports. The computing projects take time. Initially, students ran themselves out of time. Surprise, surprise. We implemented midpoint code checks to make sure they had at least working codes at the halfway point. The Zoom environment was not good for that. So we instituted code due dates to accomplish the same goal. Time management has improved a lot from where we started. We continue to work on many aspects of the learning environment 23 semesters later. As we speak, I am thinking of rewriting the assignment documents for all of the CPs. I like what we have, but I know it can be better. Now let's take a look at the instructor-to-student perspective. How do I get my students to reflect on their own learning process? We need to find ways to foster reflection with the goal of getting them to improve their learning strategies. And of course, we need to help them embrace failure, which is not a strength of the traditional environment. Our main opportunity to motivate reflective thinking is during recitation in the flipped classroom. There are many chances to diagnose student learning issues and to make suggestions for addressing them. The UGTAs are not always great at this, but the instructors can focus a fair amount of time on it. The mastery-based grading scheme was designed to break student addiction to scoring. We wanted the feedback to promote reflection rather than discourage it. The most natural student response to taking a test is, I don't want to know how badly I did. We want them to follow up on their errors and learn from them. Grading has a huge impact on their willingness to do that. Our mastery-based grading strategy has reduced test anxiety and curbed the scoring impulse a little. After each module assessment, and they take one every 2 weeks, we ask them to do a self-assessment. The goal is to have them look critically at the posted solution and give themselves a grade on each mastery objective. That keeps them thinking about what the objectives are, and it puts them into the grader's shoes. They get credit if they match the grader. Then we have them write comments about where they went wrong and how they plan to adjust their study approach to get ready for the next assessment. Students are actually pretty bad at self-assessment. Getting them to do it conscientiously is hard. All the more reason to get them to do it. We learn a lot about student study habits through this instrument. We could intervene more than we currently do, and we probably should reflect on that. Recently, we started to ask specific questions on the self-assessment about how they prepared for the exam. They respond to the 12 preparation actions shown on the slide. The fraction represents the portion of students who said yes to each item. The score of 1.000 is what we want, just like baseball. There are 2 reasons for doing this exercise. First, it gives us some insight on how they study. But more importantly, it serves as a reminder on every exam of the kinds of things they could or should be doing to help them master the subject. It's part of the reflection. The 60 students, or 60% of students, who did not read the textbook have to answer that question no. They cannot then escape the thought that reading the textbook might be something they should consider doing in the future. The computing projects all culminate in full written reports. Writing is thinking. While writing reports is a very time-consuming endeavor, it gets them out of the mentality of solving a problem, putting a nice box around the answer, and moving on with their lives. We designed the computing projects to prod them into some exploration and discovery. Writing helps them to reflect on the problem that they're solving. We also asked them to do peer reviews of the project reports. We randomly assigned them to review the reports of 3 other students. This task puts them on the other side of the teaching-learning fence. We asked them to write actionable comments on the reports they are reviewing. They are not grading the reports. They are rather trying to find ways to make them better. We have some written guidance on how to do that. As they write comments, they reflect on what they did in their own report. How can they not? When they sit down to write their next report, they are much more likely to implement a suggestion that they actually made to somebody else. Some students give remarkably good feedback to their peers. Those who receive that great feedback get good advice that they can implement. The better reviewers sometimes complain that they don't get as good as they give. But they're probably benefiting more than anyone because they engage the most in reflection. Finally, we provide feedback in a way that is meant to foster reflection. If you grade student work and just put a number or letter grade at the top, they will use it to define their self-worth. If there is a summative score, then they are less likely to read any written comments, however helpful those comments might be. The dashboard is a snapshot of what they have done in every aspect of the course up to that moment in time. They get an updated dashboard after every module assessment and every computing project. The dashboard reflects every bit of effort they have put into the course. It shows them that we value every effort they make. What the dashboard shows most clearly is what they need to work on. The mastery bar chart in the lower right corner shows their progress on each mastery objective. The simple goal in the course is to get as many bars to the top as possible, not to score 100% on a test. What they can see is what needs work. When they sit down to study, they focus on things that need work, not on things they've already mastered. There's no grade shown anywhere. There are no numbers to obsess about. Student survey comments show that they understand the shift these features make in their learning, and they seem to appreciate it. We have come a very long way in the mechanics project in the last decade. I have come a very long way as a teacher. I am living proof that a traditional academic can embrace active learning strategies through reflective and iterative teaching. When I started this adventure, there was no learning and teaching hub. I wish there had been. I learned a lot about what's known about good teaching by trying things out and then finding an article or book that supported what we were trying to do. My journey was probably harder than it needed to be, if only the hub had been there to guide me. Well, it is for you, but I'm always happy to discuss teaching strategies with anyone who wants to engage, especially if you're interested in the flipped classroom, mastery-based grading, and using computing to deepen student understanding of traditional topics. Hit me up anytime.